Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. We're going to continue our classes, our lectures, our discussions on Julius Evola today. We'll be combining two sessions into one. As I said, I had some unexpected meetings I had to attend to yesterday, so we'll be having a kind of extended session today. We will mainly be discussing essays from Julius Evola, Metaphysics of Power. We mentioned this book last time as well, in terms of how it really is a posthumous compilation of articles by the editor, the translator. And we actually began this book last time, last week, in fact, excuse me, when we discussed at length his extended essay devoted to the decline of the idea of the state. Now, I said that when he speaks of the state in this essay, it's really not in any kind of a modern sense. So naturally, with all of the traditionalist thinkers with the capital T, they are all unanimous in their rejection of the modern world. So one has to keep that in mind whenever they use any terms which have acquired certain definitions, certain connotations in the modern world, and the state is one of those. He really means something more like a polity, or even I would say something more like the concept, I would say, of the city in ancient Greek philosophy, and that same idea of the city or the Medina in Arabic comes into Islamic philosophy as well. So you have treatises like those of Al-Farabi, famous early Muslim philosopher, dealing with the kind of things that Evola is also going to deal with. And so for him, the decline of the idea of the state is intimately tied to the entropic and degenerative processes of the Kali Yuga, of which the most salient one for the purposes of the decline of the state is, of course, none other than the doctrine or the phenomenon of the regression of the castes. And indeed, this entire inaugural essay for the volume, The Metaphysics of Power, is devoted to the kinds of regime, if you like, which we could also use instead of state, that emerges under each of the traditional castes, the sacerdotal caste, the warrior caste, the merchant caste, if you like, the bourgeois caste, and the serf, servant, or slave caste. So today we're actually going to begin our session with the discussion of a companion essay. It really goes very well with the first essay in this book, although it comes in the fifth in the arrangement of this volume, The Metaphysics of Power. And that, of course, is the reconstruction of the idea of the state. So if you can have the notion of the decline of a genuine polity or regime, and he looks at the history of that in the light of the Kali Yuga, what is possible in terms of the reconstruction of a genuine regime or a genuine polity, or as he says, the state, the reconstruction of the idea. Now he says the reconstruction of the idea of the state. I really wonder if he's if he holds out any real genuine hope that such measures could ever be implemented. I think he was far too intelligent, and so I to have held such a view, and so I favor a kind of microcosmic reading of this essay, if you will, in as much as the city, the state, the regime is a reflection of a particular human being. And if you go back to the Politeia of Plato, and it's interesting that I think that's the actual name in Greek is Politeia, but they always translate it as republic even though the term republic and republicanism in modern language is associated with democracy and all of the flaws that come with democracy. At any rate, in that book, which is called, for better or worse in the English language, The Republic of Plato, the discussion really commences with the question being posed, what is justice? And Socrates proposes to discuss the concept of the city as a means of answering the question, what is justice? In the case of an individual human being, he says it's easier to understand it this way. And so I would favor maybe a microcosmic reading then, in that sense, of this essay. So he begins by referring to the previous essay, the decline of the idea of the state. He says in our last essay, we examined the decline that the idea of the state has suffered through historical times. And again, that has to do with the entropic and degenerative processes of the Kali Yuga, in which we have a movement from the pole of essence, as Genon calls it in his book, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, towards the substantial pole, or moving from quality toward an increase in quantity. And the regression of the caste is part of this. So here he speaks of the highest caste as embodying and personifying a kind of royal superhumanity. He calls it on page 55. And then you have the Kshatriya. So this would be the Brahmin caste. The Kshatriyas, you know, the caste of warrior nobility, then the merchants and the servants. The idea of the state therefore fell from one to the other of these planes, proceeding finally from the organic to the mechanical, from the superpersonal to the materialized, collectivistic, subpersonal, the Sovietized and standardized. It's interesting that Evola was of the view that this process of degeneration, of increased entropy, of chaos, of retrogression and regression, he seems to be of the view that it has reached its limit. He says it seems to have reached, the process of regression seems to have reached its limit, from which any further development cannot long tarry in taking another direction, given that we cannot go further down than we have already. And mind you, we've gone even further, descended even further, haven't we, since his time. So it remains to be seen just exactly how low the whole thing can go. And I suppose we'll find out soon enough. So he wants to look at the possibility of how one would go about restoring or reconstructing, so to speak, the concept of the state. So he makes an interesting remark here about Marxism. At the bottom of page 56, the last paragraph, it says, the ideology of Karl Marx served as a point of reference for the formation and the constitution of an entity of modern power from the ancient, promiscuous, and barbarous substance of the Slav demos. The notorious principle of popular sovereignty, together with the equally notorious principle of nationality, which had already devastated our great medieval ecumenical civilization, was premised on the revolt of the peoples of color, or at least on their autonomy, which would put an end to the supremacist dreams of the white race, master of the world. And we could go on, he says. But in the very, first and foremost, he is interested in Europe. And so he says, regarding Europe, the most pressing thing is to open our eyes to this lesson of recent history. So he is of the view that such a reconstruction must begin with an internal purification, by which he means, and I quote, an elimination of those anti-traditional, rationalistic, materialistic, mechanistic, and anti-hierarchical ideologies with which Europe is infected. Europe must first of all offer the example of detoxification. Then further down, he tells us the second step, and that is to recognize that modern civilization and society represent a deviation essentially for this reason, for that character of teratological hypertrophy of certain values with respect to others. Modern society, further on, he says, is rather characterized by a rationalization and a naturalness of the abnormal, that everything today should be measured in terms of those values which were in ancient times proper only to the inferior castes. And no one is any longer able to think save in terms of economy, of work, of politics, in the materialistic and secularized sense of, or of payment, or of service, or of collectivity, and so forth. So this is very difficult. I mean, how is it really possible, and mind you, we're speaking theoretically here, to reverse this trend? So I think there's an important realization that you have to have in reading this. There's a certain background, obviously, and we said in the very first meeting, the very first session, that Evola is very, very much indebted to the teachings of René Guénon. Now, Guénon, in probably his most important book, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, in chapter 6 and 7, which really go together, he talks about something called the principle of individuation in chapter 6, and then in chapter 7 he talks about something called uniformity against unity. And he says that the principle of individuation within a species in modern times, the species as a logical category, mind you, really has become quantity. And indeed, he even blames the scholastic philosophers for having committed an error in this regard, because they regarded matter as the principle of individuation. And for him, matter is to say matter is to say quantity. And that this further, this quantification of all things has rendered human beings also into a kind of vacuous state, whereby we have the emergence of what we may call the nameless, faceless mass man or mass human being, that is faceless and nameless in the sense that human beings have become utterly atomized and homogenized and almost alchemically processed, so that they may be subject to the suggestions and manipulations via propaganda and indoctrination by whatever the prevailing system deems to be strategically opportune. And so there is a distinction that is made by Guénon, which Evola also, I think, has in his mind when he's writing this essay, and that is the distinction between uniformity versus unity. So when you impose uniformity on people, you actually don't get unity, because uniformity comes from quantity, and quantity is the principle of multiplicity. And so no true unity is actually possible. So when Evola says on page 58 that the reconstructive problem is for this reason above all a problem of limits, that is to say of circumscription, then it is a problem of integration, of compensation, of hierarchy. So one has to do away with this kind of this kind of hegemonic or tyrannical principle of uniformity, and in the imposition of uniformity by imposing limits. So in effect, in this time of the Kali Yuga, entropy or disorder or chaos is increasing in all domains of life, whether it be the political or the economic or social, etc. And all traditional civilizations in their mythology, in their origin myths, have some notion of the imposition of cosmos on chaos. In other words, a victory over chaos, a victory over these kind of degenerative forces. And that is, again, through the imposition of certain limits, through circumscription, and through the integration of all of these elements, and that kind of integration is only possible through the imposition of a hierarchy. Now, in this respect, he sees nationalism paradoxically, or I should say a certain kind of nationalism, as a possible means or vector, shall we say, toward effecting some sort of an amelioration. I really doubt that he was so naive as to think that the process could be reversed. That would be a thoroughly anti-traditional position to take. And so he recognizes that there are really two kinds of nationalism. We're still on page 58, about 3/4 of the way down. So he talks about the phenomenon in modern political life, which are descending and have a downward direction, but nevertheless could be potential supports for reconstruction. And he identifies as, firstly, among these, the phenomenon of nationalism. So he has already observed, he says, how the nationalistic phenomenon may constitute a fall. He says, to the extent in which it signifies the advent of the democratically self-organizing collective meant to supplant the aristocratico-spiritual form of unity, as opposed to uniformity, with a thoroughly laical, that is to say secular, and then it says again, and secularized one, positing as supreme values that can be defined only by race or blood or soil or history in the inferior sense of these words, because Evola is not against race. He has his own concept of race, blood, soil, etc. So there is a second kind of nationalism, which he thinks can be a means for this kind of reconstruction. But before he does that, he also says that there is a racistic, we would say in more idiomatic modern English, a racial kind of nationalism. And let's see what else he says. Moreover, even laying aside the racistic kind of nationalism, every statization too enters this downward path. And this is true whether it proceeds from the center, absolutistically, as was the case already with the forms of nationalism favored by the kings of France, or whether it proceeds from the periphery as the social ladder of the state. For which, however paradoxical it might seem, once we have considered the essential thing, we perceive that there is at bottom nothing but a difference in degree standing between collectivistic nationalism, internationalism, and Soviet-style or American-style anonymity. Very interesting. Again, he's on more than one occasion pointed out the almost equivalence of the Soviet-style and the American-style systems in terms of the end to which they lead. He continues along this path. Again, here there's an allusion to what I already mentioned about the mass man at the bottom of this page, page 59. And thus the roads are virtually open to the rise of the mass man, without fatherland, unified by that law which was once only the law of the lowest of the traditional caste, namely work and service without light. So if you have nationalism of this kind, this is the nationalism of the lowest possible type. Taken in this aspect, nationalism finds its place in the process of the quadripartite fall, which we have clarified between the epoch of the dominion of the third caste, that is to say the merchants, the epoch of the merchants, capitalism, liberalism, plutocracy, and the epoch of the dominion of the last caste, which is Bolshevism. Now, because of this intermediate position between the third and the fourth castes, he sees it as a means for possible reascending, he calls it. This is a nationalism on page 60, which has value not for its internal collectivizing, but for its external differentiation, which is to say as a force which withdraws from the collectivistic, internationalistic collapse, reacts against it, establishes new and firm divisions within which an organizing function in the higher sense must manifest, a differentiating force which already belongs to a higher kind of force, a spiritual force. So he is actually of the view that such a nationalism may be appropriately modified and repurposed as a means of reconstruction of the idea of the state, and thereby embodying a higher kind of spiritual force. And the only way that this is possible is to, he say, by overcoming the arguments of the demagogic and socialite polemic, while leading one to believe that one battles individualism, that product of natural right dissolution, in reality turns essentially against that which is the basis and the presupposition for every civilization worthy of the name, the dignity of the person. So naturally, any kind of tendencies toward quantity, toward uniformity, they constitute an assault on the dignity of the person. So if you really want to have organization, he says, you must have differentiation. And of course, that differentiation for him is of a hierarchical nature. So this is the approach that he wants to take. And I really don't know how seriously he thought that this was actually possible, or whether this was just a kind of exercise he was engaging in. But obviously we cannot put aside the fact that he was, at least initially, very much enamored of the idea of fascism as it manifested in Italy. And as will come out also when we talk about his ideas on monarchy, that he liked the fact that Mussolini was a monarchist. And so I think he saw that fascism also in Italy, as it expressed this kind of nationalistic spirit, the kind of nationalism which he is favoring here, he may have seen that as a kind of possible bulwark against this Bolshevist and socialistic kind of tendencies of international socialism. This is why also I think he saw certain possibilities in what emerged in Germany and was known as national socialism, as opposed to an international socialism of the kind which we had in the Soviet Union. He also is very much against, and he said several times in many places, the demonic nature of the economy. So there has to be, he says on page 62, a personalization and spiritualization of the economic sphere. He says, by this route, a return can be prepared to the very spirituality of an ancient traditional corporatism. First Roman, then Romano-Germanic, not to speak of the analogous forms existing also in other extra-European peoples. There could be a personalization and a spiritualization of the economic sphere. Corporatism would suffice to differentiate, articulate, and hierarchize that which in the social whole corresponds to the corporeal vital part of a higher organism, and which formed that domain in which the two lower castes could affirm the dignity of personality through joy in work, pride in one's art, the identification of a vocation to profess, the honor of one's corporation, and the harvest of one's production. So here the word corporation obviously is not being used in the modern sense of something like, Toyota or Google. It meant an organized body of craftsmen, of tradesmen. Another word which is used in English, which may have been more appropriate here, but obviously the translator has to go with what's in the Italian, and there's probably an almost word for word cognate for that in Italian, but I don't know for sure. But at any rate, the word is guild. So there were merchants' guilds, there were craftsmen's guilds, and those were a kind of early form of corporation, which in no way resembles the modern form of corporation. And in those, people had meaningful work. They performed their vocation. And so this would be a means to as he calls it, personalize and spiritualize the economic sphere. And he also advocates that this would lead in the direction of what he calls a decongesting the state of the economy. That of decongesting the state of the economy. That is to say, to promote a self-discipline of the economy, which through the wise directives of economic peace and the cessation of the convulsions of a ridiculous economic hegemony would allow the superior energies to release and to give form to a higher plane, the task of the next integrative moment. So he also wants to rehabilitate, if that's the right word, the two lower castes. So even though he's in favor of this hierarchy, and there's absolutely no doubt about where he sees himself in that hierarchy, he's certainly not in the bottom. He's certainly a kshatriya, a kind of warrior, sage is how he sees himself. But so he doesn't really have this disdain for the lower castes, provided that they are all within this hierarchy and everyone is subordinate to the principle which is above, and then it's all fine. And that is the kind of reintegration that would be necessary. So obviously then there also has to be some kind of a warrior aristocracy. How would you bring that about? So, he talks a lot about it, but I really don't see how this is actually possible and how this could actually be pulled off. So even if, he says lots of great things here about aristocracy and warlike heroism, ideas which we've already seen in our previous session, so I'm not going to go over them, but that's for example on page 63. But he says there's another problem. So about halfway down that page 63, he recognizes that this is the Kali Yuga, and a lot of these castes, just like the lower castes, the higher castes, have been corrupted as well. So he says, leaving aside the warrior aspect, that is the ideal of a formation and higher differentiation in the terms of a warlike personality, the problem of the aristocracy in general must do without those often degenerate and corrupt lineages of that patriciate, which is today, thanks only to a tradition of titles, practically divested of its authority, and on the other hand, ready for the worst kind of concessions. So again, in praise of aristocracy, he says, we can indeed always conceive of the aristocratic type as that of a personality in which mastery of self, superiority over mere living, a kind of ascesis of power, refinement united to a sense of fidelity and honor, have become a conquest that, recorded in the blood, manifests bit by bit in the generations as a naturalness of a higher order. Such an ideal could not fail to present still a degree of prestige. And the fundamental problem in the last analysis would be to provide a corresponding education aimed toward permitting such a prestige to slowly gain ground in those strata which, finally liberated from the morbid suggestion of despots, have gone on so gloriously to extol the boxeur and the cowboy and the movie actor, at most the popular demagogue. So assuming that some sort of restoration and purification of the corrupted elements of the aristocracy and a restoration of the kind of warrior caste, then they would have to educate the lower castes, again, in the veneration of these higher castes. But again, that's not enough. So we've got to go to the highest point. And this is where it gets very difficult. So on page 64, he says, whatever their greatness, the aristocratico warrior political forms do not and cannot represent the final limit. At the highest point, spirit and power must become one thing only, and the purely aristocratic forms have always represented a secularization, and thus an involution of this higher synthesis. Thus, in the context of the present Western civilization, this point would be the hardest to resolve concretely. What he means is that originally, and we've talked about this before, the highest caste was not exactly a purely priestly caste. The function of the warrior and the king were united together. The function of the warrior as king and the priest were united in one person, in a kind of philosopher king or priest king, who wielded both sword and scepter. And this has already, this connection has already been broken, has already been bifurcated. And this is going to be very hard to resolve concretely, he says, and there's a twofold reason for this. So what is the twofold reason? Well, that is, one has to do with religion and religious tradition. And religion has become thoroughly degenerated. And so this presents a huge problem. And the problem is, how can people be made to understand, he says, that politics must not only be religion, but even super religion, that the state, to be traditional in the highest sense, must incarnate to a still higher degree than the church, a transcendent spirituality, a force which is effectively from on high, not as empty rhetoric, but as a living reality. Nazi Germany, with certain of its transformations of religious politics, has shown us into what aberrations one might fall when echoes of similar ideas fall upon an unprepared soil. So he's being very critical of whatever took place in Nazi Germany. So although he sees some positive, he has somewhat of a positive view and sees some possibilities in different forms of fascist ideology or fascist political ideologies of his time, he is also aware of their danger and the kind of aberrations they can fall into. So again, as we said, to classify him as a fascist or a Nazi is really quite simplistic. He's a very sophisticated thinker and cannot be pigeonholed. And so if one of the problems, so the twofold problem, one has to do with religion and the other has to do with the kind of anti-traditional, humanistic, materialistic civilization, which really forms the basis of the values of almost everyone today. So he quite honestly says this alternative on page 65 is excessively paralyzing. It has worked to uniformize the modern world, but not to unify it. So again, this notion of uniformity versus unity comes up again, and I can't. I'm convinced that he owes a lot to Rene again on here. Excuse me. So on page 66, well, before page 66, at the bottom of page 65, he says, he's talking about this paralysis. He says, first Enlightenment democracy with its rationalistic ideal, then Bolshevism with its technico-proletarian ideal have attempted the technique of such unification in the terms of a degrading materialism, of leveling of the mechanistic or intellectual uniformity of humanity, leading to their final consequences, the premises inherent in the very development of laical Western civilization. So he says in italics now in the next paragraph, we hold rather new life must be given to the other form of unity, to a spiritual, super-rational, and a non-international unity, made possible precisely by an integration of the various natural hierarchies in a transcendent element. And after that, he turns to this idea of the Holy Roman Empire and Ghibellinism, which is a recurring theme in his writings. And then he concludes. With this idea of what will happen or what should happen at the end of time, really. He talks about the traditional myths that speak about the definitive destruction of the Iron Age. So let's just focus on that. He says, after he talks about this Holy Roman Empire, he says the true breakpoint recedes still further, to be found in those forms in which the dualism of the Christian belief was not yet constituted, for which Servius offers testimony. He's got a whole Latin phrase here, which means that it was considered among the ancients that the king was at once priest and pontifex, for which reason even today the emperors are called pontifex. So again, he is very much devoted to the ideal of solar regality, before which every separation between spirit and power cannot help but appear as a deviation, and the inevitable principle of decline for the supreme ideal of the hierarchy. However this may be, it can be said that such a problem of the form which might be assumed in a non-anachronistic fashion by a purely spiritual authority is the supreme integration of renewed, fortified, and reorganized political bodies and as the basis for a new suprarational European reality is preceded by a series of other problems, which are still more concrete and urgent. And so further down, he says, not for nothing does the traditional myth recount that it will be the holy emperor himself, who, awakening from a symbolic slumber, must summon together those who are still faithful in order to wage the final war upon the debauching of forces which symbolize the element which every traditional hierarchy always yoked, conquered, and transfigured. We saw this also in his essay, I think, on the metaphysics of war, about this final battle and how the heroes will end up in Valhalla. So I think really as he concludes this, it's very clear that this was maybe just a kind of theoretical exercise. He held out some kind of hope for a certain kind of nationalism, but that's pretty much it. And then he concludes by saying that it is just such a myth, which must be to us as a fount of strength. Then he quotes Hesiod, the ancient Greek poet, in his Works and Days, which talks about the 4 ages, in which Hesiod exclaims that, he is expressing the wish that would that I had not been born in this age, but had died before, or had been born afterwards. Against this, Evola continues after that quotation from Hesiod. Against this, other traditions teach that those who endure against all odds in the dark age will be supremely rich with supernatural fruits. The forces which still remain standing, despite everything, will find congenial this truth of the ancient heroic vocation of Western man, of the man who already knew the prayer, Lord, for our enemies, give us the strong. And that's how it ends. So I also think that this is a kind of, maybe has to be read microcosmically, that this is maybe kind of a theoretical exercise, and he sees that ultimately nothing is going to happen in the external world, and this must be brought out about within the person, unless they live till the end of the cycle. That's my take on this rather peculiar essay. Before we go further, I don't know if you want to chime in about how you understood it. I think that the other essay on the decline of the idea of the state is a much more straightforward one to read. But this, in the light of the whole notion of the Kali Yuga and the inexorable decline of all things and the increase in entropy, I find it difficult to understand this essay in any other way. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you said your choice of words to read it microcosmically.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, I kind of I was also struck by the kind of the more idealistic side of this essay, where I
Yeah.
mean it's kind of natural where if anyone is proposing anything new, it will sound like idealistic at first, and especially with people as such a his commitment to his traditionalism is so unwavering that it
Yeah.
will naturally sound kind of more unrealistic. And I think you're right, he doesn't expect that to be coming anytime soon. But as for
Yeah.
but as for what but I think he is sincere in saying like nationalism can have that effect, because if you think about it, what I was thinking of kind of contemporary examples to see, well, is his prediction
Right.
kind of right
Mm-hmm.
or wrong, and I think it's kind of right, because well, at least from what I've paid attention to in some of the attempts by the American right to seize on some populism in the wake of Trump,
Yeah.
their strategies, I think, do reflect what Evola said. So on one hand, you have the people who are on the right, but they are have maybe a bit less vision, so they are going after the bourgeois appeal, or the I guess Evola would call them lower caste appeal.
Yeah.
Whereas someone with a bit more vision might say that you don't have to necessarily appeal or act, quote, relatable to most people in order to succeed. You can advocate things that are maybe too advanced for, some people, and they, if you have the correct energy or charisma, they will kind of understand. So I think that's kind of what I was thinking of when Evola
Mm,
talk about re-educating
yeah.
even the lower caste, because it's not the assumption that it's a kind of a wrong assumption made by, or caused, I guess, by the mass politics, that you have to act a certain way to get this certain appeal, and that's also promoting bad tendencies in the electorate, to expect the free goods from the whoever's appealing to them, and
Mhm.
having kind of, not looking for anything more in their leader, something like that. I think that's what he's kind of referring to relate it to modern day.
Well, it's interesting that you relate this to the Trumpists, how you did that. And I think that that would work in the case of other examples as well, by which I mean a kind of resurgence of a kind of right-wing politics in many countries right now. Whether that's, and again, I'm speaking very much secondhand because I haven't visited these countries in all cases. But for example, what happened in Brazil, right, with this politician Bolsonaro, Marine Le Pen in France, for example, Modi in India. I mean, I do have experience of India, but I haven't been there in years. But they all seem to be riding a kind of wave of a certain kind of nationalism. But is that the kind of nationalism that Evola would have favored? And, the kind of reascending nationalism, as he calls it, I think that's a very fine line, because I think that in the case of all those examples, including the example you gave of Trump, I don't see any of these individuals as being very profound people. In fact, I think they're really more in the direction of demagogues, and they understand that is a certain kind of anger in some cases, a certain kind of fire, if you like, a passion in certain segments of the citizenry. And they have read that very rightly, and they have ridden that wave, and they've taken those people as their constituency, and they're really just interested in power. I mean, we'll see that Evola was very much opposed to party politics, and he really found it quite disgusting. So that's why, again, I find it very surprising that people come back to the United States, the kind of people who were around Trump, individuals such as Steve Bannon, who apparently had some Evola quotes in something which he wrote, I think on the Breitbart News platform, which he headed for some time. I really think these guys are just, they use Evola as grist for their mill. They just take some nice quotations, and in the final analysis, they're really interested in the raw exercise of power. I don't think that they have any kind of higher motivation or even awareness of any higher spiritual principle, which Evola certainly had, and from the point of view of which he wrote everything that he wrote. So I think that these kind of writings of Evola, particularly the essay we read today, are very much capable of being, if not misunderstood, misused by people of that of the kind of examples we spoke.
Yeah, I think I agree for the
You agree?
most part in terms of I think it is, like you said, and Evola would probably agree that it's optimistic for anyone to assume people have such a vision. And I think the most apt way to describe those, movements around the world would be uh the proto version of the
Mhm.
aristocracy that he already says is not spiritual enough. You know what I mean? Because he
Yeah,
already, yeah. So it's the proto of the stage that is not even the highest stage yet. But for what we have right now, we have to make do with it.
make do with what's available, I guess. Yeah. Perhaps I don't know. What Evola would have thought about the world today in 2022. But for my own part, I don't really see um any possibility for an ameliorative and I do not see any possibility for ameliorative measures to mitigate the Kali Yuga on the political level. But that's just my opinion. You know, whether Evola would have agreed with me or not, we will never know. So let's go to the next item on the reading list, the next reading. These are all all of the readings for today are connected in some way or another. I mean, and of course, all of his writings throughout this thread of the heroic warrior ideal, I think, runs throughout. And this comes up again in his discussion of the family, because he sees the family again as a heroic unity. Again, this idea of unity as opposed to uniformity. And this unity versus uniformity again comes up in the reading on feminism, the twilight of civilization, and also in his discussion of monarchy, with which we will probably conclude today. I think that if you have access to the book, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, do you have a copy of that book, Nico?
I think I do. Let me double check.
Yeah, you could probably find some kind of a copy online easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I do.
Well, I think that you would find that a very interesting read, especially the 2 chapters I talked about. And in fact, I am still in the process of recording. I have a series going on.
Yes, I've seen those.
You've seen those?
Yeah, some of those, yeah.
So I'm just checking if we've uploaded the rest of it, because I've recorded a few more. And I don't think those are up yet, but I've gone up to what has been uploaded is up to chapter 5. Yeah, up to chapter 5. And so I've done the next few chapters. By next week, I'll have recorded all the way up to chapter 10, and we'll be uploading those like 1 a week. So if you, it's up to you, obviously, but I think you might find it interesting to read get on as well. And if you do, I do have a detailed lectures on those available for you on YouTube. So
yeah.
Great. So let's go to what page is this? Feminism and the Twilight of Civilization. It's the same book, The Metaphysics of Power, and that's on pages 97 to 102. I think this is a very well-written essay. Of course, we're reading it in translation, but the translation reads so well. So again, in the context of the downward movement, the degenerative and entropic processes of the Kali Yuga, they impose a certain kind of uniformity. And here in this essay, Feminism, the Twilight of Civilization, Evola looks at the leveling, the depersonalization, and uniformitization extending into the realm of into the realm of sex, or the realm of gender as well. He begins, the leveling and depersonalizing plague, which has brought low our modern civilization, has aspects which are so complex and tentacular that not everyone is able to recognize it behind its various masks, so as to oppose each of its forms with a decisive revolt and conscious reaction. So among these complex tentacular aspects is the thoroughly corrosive role and influence of feminism. Further down page 97, he says, after the leveling wrought between man and man, we proceed now to that between gender and gender. It sees in this a conquest, a sign of progress from the very same anti-hierarchical and anti-qualitative origin of many forms of modern degenerescence, an interesting word, we now see feminism emerging, as if in a retching action, quite a turn of phrase. It is taking shape in two countries which have become almost like the two jaws of a single pair of closing vice grips from the East and from the West around ancient Europe, namely Soviet Russia and America. It's interesting, I don't know if you know this, there is a Russian thinker by the name of Alexander Dugin, who is heavily influenced by Guénon as well as Evola. Apparently, he's close to Vladimir Putin, and he has been very vocal in his support for the Russian military adventure in Ukraine. His books were banned in the United States, and today we found out that there was an attempt on his life. They blew up his car, but he wasn't in it. In fact, it was his daughter, and she ended up perishing. I don't know if you heard about this.
Yeah, I heard about Dugin, and then the news. I mean, I heard about him before, and now the news is, recent. So yeah,
Yeah,
pretty.
I just thought of that because Dugin says many things along the lines of what's in this essay. Let me just get that. I mean, Dugin's most famous book, he's really known for this thing called The Fourth Political Theory. But you can't buy that book now. It's been, I think, taken off Amazon and other platforms, but you can buy it, on the used book market. But he has another book, 2021, called The Great Awakening versus the Great Reset. It's a thin book. And so I remember when they banned all of his books, there's no official ban, but when you can't buy them on Amazon, you can't buy them on online platforms, and you can't even buy them at Barnes and Nobles or barnesandnoble.com. That's an effective banning. So he was sanctioned. When I found that out, I went and I got all of his books, actually. I probably would not have done that if he hadn't been banned, but there you go. So not to digress, but he has many similar views. He's an Orthodox Christian, capital O, Russian Orthodox. And you'll find very similar views there that of the kind Evola is espousing here in this essay, Feminism in the Twilight of Civilization. So if we go to the next page, you remember I said that Evola talks about how in every traditional civilization, you have some kind of a myth of a triumph of order over chaos. And he sees this kind of imposition of uniformity, this leveling, this downward movement. Recall the idea of the psychology of skiing, ascent versus descent. And feminism as a manifestation of this is yet another instance of this moving toward chaos. So in some ways, I see people like Julius Evola, and I would say even Dugin, but Dugin to a lesser extent, as diagnosticians, so to speak, of the Kali Yuga. And in that sense, Evola certainly extends many of the analyses which are of a much more synthetic character of René Guénon by addressing specific instances such as feminism and other dimensions of life, at least in the 20th century, especially in Evola's book, Men Among the Ruins, Recognitions, and of course the Metaphysics of Power. Dugin somewhat less so. I don't see Dugin really as a traditionalist with a capital T. He's probably a traditionalist with a lowercase t. He's definitely heavily influenced by these guys, but he has his own thought. So here on page 98, this idea of a victory of order over chaos is mentioned by Evola. He says the fundamental meaning of every civilization was that of a victory of form over the formless, of the cosmos over the chaos. Thus, at the center of the classical vision of life and of the state, we characteristically find precisely the cult and the valorization of the limit of the form, of difference, of the clear personality. I recall in the previous essay, he also talks about how the regression of the castes can only be reversed or ameliorated through an imposition of limits. So we find precisely the cult and the valorization of the limit, of the form, of difference, of the clear personality. And when he says form, I don't know if you paid attention to that, but, and again, even though this is a translation, I think that you've got to read very closely. He means form in the Platonic sense. And
yeah, I kind of noted that too. I think it's
did.
like yeah, because I think in Ganon, in one of the videos, form matter distinction is important as well.
Very important. The distinction between matter and form goes back to Aristotle. That is the distinction between hule and morphe. But when Plato speaks of the forms in the sense of the doctrine of the forms, which sometimes in English is also called the doctrine of the ideas, the term that's being used for form is actually eidos, from which we get the word idea in English. And for traditionalist thinkers with a capital T, such as Guénon and certainly Evola, form is much more fundamental. And it's towards quality as opposed to matter, which is in the direction of the pole of substance or quantity. So the world, he says, is cosmos and not chaos, to the extent that it, like a harmonious living organism, is constituted by a whole of finite parts, each of which has a precise function proper to it and unmistakable in the whole. Its good, its truth, therefore does not consist in the cessation of its individuality and its receding toward the non-qualified, the identical, the indefinite, toward that in which all things mystically and atomistically become a single thing, but rather in being evermore itself and expressing ever better its proper nature, in carrying its individuation even deeper, thus rendering the great body of the whole richer, more various and determinate. Now you have to understand also that for Guénon, the principle of individuation is form, not matter, not quantity. And so really what he's saying, and it will become clear very soon in the next couple of pages, is that you cannot uniformitize the genders. There is man qua man, and there's woman qua woman. And they have different natures. They are both instantiations of the human species. They come under that, but human species and all biological species, all life is differentiated according to two genders. Obviously, this is not a popular thing to say nowadays, and I can't imagine what Evola would have thought about our contemporary American landscape. So our best traditions, he says, always set this valorization. Which valorization? The valorization of form over the formless. This valorization of difference, of the limit, of individuation against all evasionistic and pantheistic visions which posit the good to lie in the impersonal, in the undifferentiated, so that they almost understand being an individual as a fault or a punishment. And so Evola is very much lamenting, and he saw all of this very early on. He's lamenting this situation. And he says that, in his lament, at present, nothing is itself. No natural being is itself. But this condition of intermixing, which was traditionally recognized to the things below, was always considered to be a condition of imperfection, and the task was given to institutional norms, imposing limits to morality, and finally to ascesis, to overcome it and to clarify distinct types, genres, classes, and individuals. Such was the traditional concept of culture or civilization. Form, let us say it again, he writes, victorious over chaos. On page 99, he continues saying, it is altogether evident. He's really quite eloquent throughout this chapter. It is altogether evident that a contradiction of this point of view is constituted by the principles of egalitarianism, mindless fraternalism, pallid humanitarianism, and impersonal universalism, which in various forms wind through the modern world, undermining not only the concepts of society and the state of right, but even the ideals of knowing and acting. And then he turns to the point of departure of this essay, the title of this essay, and he says that the face of modern feminism is equally clear on this basis. So he's very much against these very loud, shrill demands for equality, for this kind of leveling downward uniformitarian egalitarianism in which every difference and every distinction is held to be an evil. He says that such a mindset would abolish the specificity of functions and types. It would tend to something uniform, which, however, we will not say lies as is believed beyond, but rather within individuation and differentiation of the sexes. The result, he says, is precisely either the altogether new, neutral, and Amazonic type of American women, and of the sportive European, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, garçones, I think, or in French it means tomboy, you know, a female that acts like a male, and so forth. He sees this as a retrogressive movement, obviously a degenerative movement, a degenerative process, part of the increasing entropy of the Kali Yuga. I don't know if you have heard of this person, but there is a Canadian professor of English language and literature. I don't know what her first name is, but her last name is Fiamengo. And she had more than 100 videos on YouTube. And that channel, if I'm not mistaken, or at least that series, the channel name I think was different, was called the Fiamengo Files. And these 100+ videos were all very well written. I think she's probably reading from a teleprompter, otherwise she's extremely elegant and eloquent lady. And all of her videos are against feminism. And because she's a woman who denounces the feminists, after some time, she was canceled, as they say, and her channel was deleted. And then all of her videos ended up on, I think she's moved them to some other platform like Odyssey, you know, O-D-Y, I think Odyssey is 2 E's on the end. Or some of these other alternative video channels like BitChute, you know, on which you find all sorts of other things. But she says many of the same sorts of things that Evola is saying here. Namely that at the bottom and root of feminism is a kind of pessimism, a kind of, you know, anger, and a kind of hatred. And here on page 100, I think Evola is especially eloquent, and it's worth reading what he has to say here. The truth is rather that at the bottom of feminism, there hides a radical pessimism. That is the tacit premise that woman, as woman, cannot find value in herself, for which she must, insofar as she can, make herself into a man, claim the same social and intellectual prerogatives of man. In this sense, we call it pessimism. The presumed feminist vindication of woman conceals an abdication of modern woman, her impotence or her mistrust at being and at having value as that which she is as woman, and not as man. It conceals, in short, a degeneration, in the most rigorous sense of the term, to which, moreover, modern man analogously brutalizes himself into a purely physical and animal ideal, at most a pallidly intellectual one, which represents his own decline from the zenith forms of life, which consecrated his effective virility, to which corresponded in our greatest traditions the two highest castes of the social hierarchy, that of the ascetics and that of the warriors. It is as woman and not as man that woman realizes herself, elevates herself to the same level as man, as ascetic and as warrior, insofar as she is lover or mother. To us, the lineage of every value is one and the same. Heroism. So you see this concept of heroism just runs throughout the thought and writing of Evola. Overcoming of oneself. But there is an active heroism and a negative heroism. There's the heroism of absolute affirmation, and there's the heroism of absolute obedience. There's the heroism of absolute affirmation, he repeats, and there is the heroism of absolute dedication, which each stand in an identical light and at an identical level of greatness. Thus, this differentiation decrees the natural difference of ways toward interior consummation for man and for woman. To the gesture of the warrior and of the ascetic, who pass from life to a more than life, the one by means of pure action, the ascetic, that would be the warrior, and the other by means of a clear and virile renunciation, that would be the ascetic, ideally corresponds in woman to the heroism of the leap, to be wholly for another being, to give herself wholly to another being, to be he the man whom she loves and who is her lord, the type of the lover, or be it her child, the type of the mother. Finding in this the sense of her life, her own joy, her own justification and liberation, and in realizing oneself ever more intensely and luminously according to these two distinct and unmistakable directions of heroism, attenuating everything in man that is woman and everything in woman that is man. In this stands the internal rule which can give form and order according to nature and spirit. That is a really well-written summation of the corrosive power or the corrosive nature of feminism, and why he sees this unbridled feminism as leading to the twilight of civilization. And he sees this corrosive influence, especially in the destruction, I really think is the best word. He doesn't use that word, but I really think that fits here. The destruction of the notion and possibility of genuine love itself. He says the modern world, on the other hand, with its boxeurs, with its fanatics of passion and of the most wretched ambitions, with its goldmongers and car salesmen and chauffeurs, in the place of the ascetics and the warriors, or on the other side with its garçons and its working girls and its intellectuals, its girls, and all other forms of naturalized women forced pathetically into the crossroads of public life and modern corruption, this modern world proceeds at a running pace in precisely the opposite direction of the above ideal, the heroic ideal, ascetic and warrior ideal. But this cannot help, he says, but be accompanied by the twilight of love itself, in the deepest organic sense, a phenomenon connected in turn to the biological destiny of the races itself. For love, like electricity and magnetism, is based on polarity. It is all the stronger and more creative, the more decisive is the polarity, the differentiation of the types and of the sexes, absolute woman and absolute man, without intermediary forms. So when you have this kind of situation of the emancipated conscious woman, where you have what he calls the equivocal camaraderie that you find, in his view, in the what was, at least at that time, the Soviet Union. He speaks of pallid intellectual sympathies between these kind of men and women. He says, in such situations, there might be encounters of pleasure, just as one might accord to a game of bridge. But, he says, there cannot be love in its true and elementary sense, in which the ancients saw the manifestation of an originating and awesome force and a cosmic significance. He concludes by noting that pure feminist egalitarianism will lead us ever more toward an insipid and perverted world, in which, perhaps as can already be seen in the banal exhibitionism of American women, women can even seem chaste, so as not so much as brush the complications of sinfulness. I think that's a very prophetic essay, very well written, even in translation. I think it very much sums up the situation we find ourselves in, particularly in America, but not just in America, in much of the modern world. Of course, ideas like this are not at all smiled upon in the Muslim world. In some places, much less than others. Many examples come to mind, but I think that it's interesting that one of the most virile and warrior kind of societies in modern times would have been pre-war Japan. But there also, now in post-war Japan, the place has been completely transformed. So I think this is a very interesting and very well-constructed essay by Evola, again, indebted, I think, to certain ideas that are in a very synthetic and integral form presented in The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times, as well as other writings by René Guénon. And so once again, Evola shows himself to be an excellent diagnostician and commentator on the degenerative processes of the Kali Yuga. I wonder if you have any thoughts on this essay.
Oh yeah, sure. I think it's a very, like you said, it's not just prophetic, but it's kind of the idea uh of differentiation is quite a profound point, because you can apply it to, you know, everyone, so many people on the online, right? I guess, a lot of them are, kind of young men, and some of them are frustrated on this issue. And, despite that, they still have very good arguments. And, what Evola says here is kind of like the bedrock of those perspectives that they may not even know about. That's how influential it is among, even within the relatively, small sphere of the online right, that is kind of a not the mainstream political right in the US or in the West. But anyway, so to get to the content of the point, it's kind of like the spirit of love, like you said, it's kind of, it requires that differentiation, because if everything is the same, then there's no like attractor, like Evola said about with the magnets example. That's a very good one.
Magnet, yeah.
There is no like something that is outside myself that I am interested in because of the mystery, because of the exclusivity, I guess is another way to put it. So it's like when everyone thinks they get what they want with the libertinism, sexually, and or then everyone's levels of affection, counterintuitively get less, and that perspective of needing differentiation and needing to not dissolve everything like into chaos, like it can apply, it applies to everything. So like that's how that traditionalism is a very cohesive system, because you can apply it in one dimension to feminism, another dimension to politics. So it's the same kind of trend.
No, that's very well said. I liked how you characterized this essay as him getting really to the bedrock of the issue. Again, the cohesiveness of traditionalism with capital T, as opposed to just sort of knee-jerk reactions and responses. I mean, it's one thing, to say, oh yes, well, men need to be, to fight, for example, or to be involved in forms of physical culture and so forth. Well, this is just characterized now as toxic masculinity. So people toss around these kind of labels on both sides of the issue, without really, again, having that bedrock and any kind of an integrated and cohesive worldview rooted ultimately in metaphysical principles that can really address the situation. So I wonder what Evola would have thought of the term toxic masculinity. I was really surprised, I didn't, because I'm a little bit isolated. I'm not on, on any college campus right now, but these are the kinds of terms that are being bandied about. There's committees and, you can be reported or banned. There's all sorts of strange kind of Gestapo-like tactics on different college campuses. I don't know if you have that where you are. But I learned about all of this about a year ago, and I was absolutely astounded to find that.
Well, yes, I think that's a great example of the thing you talked about before, or we throughout these videos, is the alchemical processing on one hand, which has resulted in these concepts that come out of nowhere and yet are enforced with such, they're enforced so dogmatically on one hand, and yet they seem to come out of nowhere. So it's like kind of amazing how then, like you said, you yourself were surprised. And unfortunately, a lot of people who encounter it just don't think this is surprising. They just say, okay, this is the trend of the age, just go with it. So you know Evola's sense of whatever, even if it might be distant, the potential to re-educate the lower classes, I think is kind of proved by how easily, well, actually maybe not, but it's because in this case concepts like toxic masculinity is appealing to the baser instincts. So obviously a spiritual re-education will be much harder. But I think what Evola is trying to say is that these people who came to believe in these feminist ideas, and in his day is much less than now, right? This is not, it's not only that it's not traditional, who said it's better than tradition? And is it an artifact? What post-war intellectual came up with it, and suddenly everyone's adopting it? So there's a kind of idea there that we think this is how it always was, to the point that in some they're trying to impute these ideas back into history, saying, oh, this certain society was actual feminist. That's how much it has, that's what I'm saying is the idea that this is how it is, even though it's very recent, is so pervasive that Evola's sense is trying to say that, hang on, who thought this was a good idea, basically.
Yeah, I think there are a number of important points there. This idea of alchemical processing is a phrase which actually is not my own. There is a very controversial writer, probably even more controversial than Evola, named Michael Hoffman II. And he wrote a book called Psychological Societies, Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, which is a self-published book. And then he in which he used that phrase, and then he came out with another updated version of it called Twilight Language, I think last year or in 2020. And there he develops the idea further, this idea of the alchemical processing. I think there he's quite interesting. But in other ways, in other areas, I completely disagree with him. He's an evangelical Protestant, and he's very committed to his Christian beliefs. And again, there's nothing in and of itself wrong with that. But then he has other books on, written against the Catholic Church and how there's this great conspiracy in the Catholic Church and so forth. So, everything he writes isn't perfect. I mean, no one is. You have to take some of what he says with a grain of salt. But again, these ideas don't come out of nowhere. And this whole tendency is studied, of what we're talking about, is studied in great depth by another controversial writer, also published by Arctos, that publishes a lot of the latest translations of Evola. And that is the book called The Perversion of Normality by Carrie Bolton. That's worth looking at, in which he traces the whole history of this, and feminism is part of it. But I don't know if you read the New York Review of Books, but in the summer issue, so that's August 18th, 2022, there is a review of a book called Hotbed, Bohemian Greenwich Village and the Secret Club That Sparked Modern Feminism by Joanna Skutz, published by Seal, SEAL, 405 pages, $30. So it's interesting, that when certain people on the right, such as Michael Hoffman, are labeled conspiracy theorists, or Carrie Bolton, who's labeled a conspiracy theorist, for talking about how there were certain secret, associations and organizations that were behind this tendency or that tendency. And in the case of feminism, this occurs in the very title, The Secret Club That Sparked Modern Feminism. And the review is by Vivian Gornick, and the title of the review is What We Want Is to Start a Revolution. There are interesting photos as well. You might be able to read this article for free in the online version of the New York Review of Books, but I have the print version. So that's a very interesting essay, and this arrived in the mail just as I was reading this essay by Evola and the Metaphysics of Power. So synchronicity, interesting, huh? This essay ties in also very nicely with his essay called The Family as a Heroic Unity on pages 115 to 120 of the same book, The Metaphysics of Power. This is also just a brilliant essay, very nicely constructed and very well written as well. So again, to bring this into modern events, again, a lot of people on the right, they talk about the importance of family and the family unit and so forth. But again, it's usually put in the form of very sort of Protestant Christian religious beliefs and teaching, which is very much just rooted in a moralizing kind of sentimentality, bourgeois mediocrity, things of this kind. Again, the metaphysical dimension is completely absent. It doesn't mean that people who favor the family who come from such a viewpoint or argue in such terms are wrong. But I would say that they are right, in fact, but they are right for the wrong reasons. Because again, they lack this metaphysical perspective or dimension. And what I find fascinating in this essay is how even here, when talking about the fundamental institution of society, namely the family, that Evola connects it to heroism, the heroic principle, and indeed warlike heroism, to use the phrase from that essay in The Metaphysics of War. So let's jump right in. The family as heroic unity. He begins the essay, one of the perils which menace all reaction against the forces of disorder and of corruption that are devastating our civilization and our social life is the tendency to wind up embracing forms which are little more significant than those of mere bourgeois domesticity. So I think he's alluding to that tendency that I just mentioned in the form in America of, certain people on the right wing who are, pro-family values, as they say in America. More than once, we have heard denunciations of the decadent character of moralism as compared to every superior form of law and of life. In truth, if an order is to have value, it must not signify routine nor depersonalized mechanization. There must exist forces which are originally untamed and which can serve in some way and to some extent their nature, even in the most rigid adherence to discipline. Only then does order become fecund. We could express this in an image. An explosive and expansive mixture, when constrained to a limited space, develops its efficacy to the extreme, while, if it is placed in boundless space, it almost dissipates. So again, the notion of limit he talks about how Goethe, the great German thinker and poet, man of letters, spoke of a limit which creates. So the notion of limit is extremely important in the classical vision of life, by which classical, we mean ancient Greece, Hellas. The idea of the limit, or in Greek, peras, which in terms of the notion is also close to the idea of telos, or end, because peras was taken as an expression of perfection itself. It was posited, according to Evola, as the highest ideal, not only in ethical terms, but even in metaphysical terms. And it's interesting that in Islamic legal and ethical terminology, they also talk about limits. They use the term of had, the divine limits, or the divine boundaries or boundary conditions in which one is supposed to live out human existence. So this notion of limit, these considerations outlined in this opening paragraph, he says, could be applied to all sorts of things, into a variety of domains, he says, but here he wants to focus on applying all of this to the notion of the family. He observes that the family as an institution has been thoroughly eroded by modern so-called cosmopolitan civilization, that its foundations have been undermined, again, by what? By feminism, which we already talked about, by what he calls Americanism and Sovietism, and that the family is in need of rebuilding. So how is one to go about that? Well, you have to examine the roots of this problem. So he says, this is on page 116, a little more than about halfway down. He says, if one wishes to find one of the earlier causes of the corruption and the dissolution of the family which have arisen in the most recent times, it can be indicated precisely in the state of a society wherein the family is reduced to signify nothing more than convention, bourgeois respectability, sentimentalism, hypocrisy, and opportunism. So again, he says that if you really go back to the roots, to the origins, and here he has really in mind his own nation, because he's referring to the Roman tradition of the family. He says if you go back to those roots, you find really what needs to be restored. Now, he doesn't use the following term, and that is the term tribe. I'm using that, but I think that the notion of tribe is really fundamental in what he outlines over the next few pages, inasmuch as a tribe is just really an extended family. A tribe has a patriarchal figure, and the members of the tribe are his family members and their family members. And so it's an extended family or familial, shall we say, corporation in the original sense and linguistic sense of the term corporation. Evola writes, according to the original conception, again, he's going back to the Roman tradition, the family is neither a naturalistic nor a sentimental unity, but an essentially heroic unity. Very important sentence. It is known that the ancient denomination of pater, the Latin word for father, derives from a term which designated the leader. Now, there's a footnote here talking about how when we say designated the leader, so the word leader in the original Italian is duce. And that is related to the Latin term dux, D-U-X, from which you get the English word duke, D-U-K-E. So I thought that was an interesting point. But the duce, or the leader here, after that in English, he has the comma, the king. So the ancient denomination of pater derives from a term which designated the leader, the duce, namely the king, the rex. Excuse me. So the unity of the family, already for this reason, appeared therefore as that of a group of beings joined in a virile manner around a lord, who to their eyes appeared invested with a brute power, but also with a majestic dignity. such as to arouse veneration and fidelity. So this notion of fidelity or fides, very important for Evola in the discussion of the family. This character is moreover confirmed if one recalls that in the Indo-European civilizations, the pater, as well as the leader, the dux, is the man who exercised an absolute rulership over his kith and kin, insofar as he was at one and the same time absolutely responsible for his kith and kin before every superior hierarchical order. He was also the priest of his gens. Gens is the Latin term, or gens, for says in the footnote, people, populace, or folk. This word is very important to Evola, and he discusses it at length in another collection, which we'll start delving into in the next session, which is called another collection of essays, which is entitled The Bow and the Club. And he has a very long essay in there on the meaning of the decay of words. And he discusses this and many other important Latin words there. So he was also the priest of his gens, for he more than any other represented his people before the divine. He was the custodian of the sacred flame, which in the patrician families was the symbol of a supernatural influence invisibly joined to the blood and transmuted with the same. No soft social sentiments nor conventionalism, but something between the heroic and the mystical, therefore founded the solidarity of the familiar or popular group, transforming it into a single unified thing through relations of participation of virile dedication such that it was ready, to rise up united against whomever might injure it or offend its dignity. So this concept of the family is rooted in the Latin notion of pater familias. So this pater is he's not just a patriarchal figure, but he is a regal figure. He has a royal dignity, as it were, attached to him. And that royal dignity, that supernatural authority is what really confers on the family its actual, or really is the essence of the family, that it is the form, so to speak. Now, in the Kali Yuga, the degeneration of the family is the mere reduction to it of a particular kind of association or relationship between a man and a woman, solemnized usually by some sort of religious rites, and but which has been infected with a kind of what he calls the bourgeois fidelity, which is nothing, according to him, but a kind of decadent and debilitated shadow. Whereas in the ancient conception, he says the ancient dedication of the woman, who gives everything and asks nothing, is the expression of an essential heroism. Remember, we saw this already in his essay on feminism. Much more mystical or ascetic, we are tempted to say, than passionate or sentimental, and in any case, transfiguring. According to an ancient saying, there is no special rite or teaching for the woman. Let her venerate her husband as her god, and she will obtain her own celestial place. So he doesn't source this saying. He just says this is an ancient saying. I don't know if that comes from the Latin tradition, if it's ancient Greek. I don't know, but that's what he has. The conception of another tradition, he continues in the next paragraph on page 118, has a near parallel here. According to that conception, the solar house of immortality was reserved not only for the warriors fallen on the field of battle, remember the land of Valhalla, which we met in Meditations on the Peaks, and for the lords of divine lineage, but also for the women who died bringing a son into the light of day. In this was seen a sacrificial offering as transmutational as that of the heroes themselves. There are Islamic traditions that indicate that childbirth is the jihad of the woman, the sacred war of the woman, and that any woman who dies in childbirth is regarded as a martyr in the Islamic tradition. And so Evola says that this confers upon the very this confers upon generation itself a very profound meaning. And he doesn't want to go into any further too much detail. This is on page 119, but he simply says that there is an ancient formula which indicates that the firstborn son, again, this is in the Roman tradition, was considered to be the son not of love, but of duty. And this duty was once again of character, both mystical and heroic. So apparently in various traditions, I think he means Indo-European traditions, he says, in fact, you could find examples of this in others, but I'm sure he has in mind Indo-European traditions in terms of the whole context of the essay. He talks about ancient Rome and then he talks about Indo-European traditions. So he says, therefore, in not a few traditions, I think Indo-European, we find formulae and rites which bring to mind the idea of authentic conscious generation, of generation not out of a dark and semi-conscious act of the flesh, but through the body and at the same time through the spirit, literally giving life to a new being with regard to his invisible function. It was even said of this being that by virtue of his existence, the ancestor would be confirmed in immortality and glory. So here he's even conferring he's talking about a kind of sacred character in ancient Indo-European traditions to the procreative act itself, especially if it is engaged in with the intention of siring a male heir to continue the line. From these testaments, he says, which are but a few from among the great many that could easily be gathered, issues a conception of familial unity which, as it stands, beyond every conformist and moralist bourgeois mediocrity and every abusive individualistic presumption, stands equally far removed from sentimentalism, passion, and everything related to brute social or naturalistic facts. The family receives its highest justification when set upon a heroic foundation. Again, very well worded, very well written. I think he really sets the issue straight there. Again, going back to traditional teachings, albeit of a Roman in the first instance, and then in a more general sense, Indo-European traditions, but nevertheless rooted in metaphysical principles. And I would argue that you could find similar teachings or analogous rites and rituals, excuse me, in other spiritual traditions around the world. So I hope that you found that interesting. I think we have another couple of these to look at. On monarchy is a rather, oh no, there's thoughts on electoral politics and then monarchy. We'll look at those. I don't know if you, in view that the theme is somewhat different in the next couple of chapters from this book, I don't know if you want to add anything, if you have anything you want to discuss or comment upon in this essay on the heroic nature of the family, or the family as heroic unity.
Yeah, just closing thoughts. I think what he said about families being considered kind of bourgeois, you know, that's, I think, another kind of very kind of prophetic statement, because when you see how the definition of the family is kind of warped nowadays
Yeah.
to for political ends, or to bring in a certain kind of to make everything more malleable, I guess is the way, another way to say it. Then that's definitely right. It's seen more as just another way of living, basically, rather than you know, having a defined form like Ebola talks about. And that's okay. That's on one side in terms of changing definitions, which is wrong. On the other side, some politicians, like I was thinking of before, are about, when they say they're about family values, what they might mean is keeping those families, you know, it's kind of a outdated term, but on the reservation, as they say, or maybe so it's basically, we will give you certain benefits if you have a family, but that does not give the politicians an incentive to improve the bigger issues, basically, if their kind of constituents have, you know, enough, it could be welfare, it could be, you know, it's basically appealing to that bourgeois sensibility that Evola, I think, is meaning to say. It.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh yeah, that's
You
all. Yeah.
muted yourself by accident.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was just gonna say, I think that's all. I think that's a great, you know, that insight quite, you can see it now, is my point.
Well, I think what's again very interesting is he talks about the family as a heroic unity. And so again, this idea of unity versus uniformity is very important, because there's again this uniformitarian trend in the Kali Yuga, extends to all areas of life. And so, as does secularization. So there's been the secularization of the concept of the family as well. And an almost a kind of not just modification, but really a kind of transmutation of the notion of family itself in a very, I would say, diabolical direction. Again, the notion of the family itself is also part of the alchemical processing. So that, well, there's all sorts of family, and you see this also in the modern media and entertainment is really for often a form of propaganda and indoctrination. And you see this over time in American television programs, whether they are of a dramatic or a comedic situation, comedy, what have you, film, where you originally have some kind of a family, but then gradually there's an erosion of that. You have characters that I can't think of exact titles, but I mean, if you've watched a lot of American TV, because I grew up in America, I saw this, and this would gradually change the way the family was presented, and sometimes the family would be eliminated completely. There's a very famous example is the American TV show, hugely popular, called Friends, in which family doesn't really play a role at all. It's just your friends. Then there was a series which came out, maybe like 10, 11 years ago, called Modern Family, which was also very strange. So you have this kind of destruction of the notion of the family itself. So this, I think, is also an interesting point, a very prophetic essay again. I liked one thing you just said now about malleability. I think that when we move again in the direction of more and more quantification, more and more uniformity, atomization, that and the emergence of the mass man, when things are so utterly uniformed, and when you have this uniformitarian tendency, that's what makes things completely amorphous and chaotic and without form, and therefore they can be molded into something else. So I think it was very interesting you using that term malleable. Maybe you may or may not have meant it in that way, or maybe I've taken it in a direction maybe you wouldn't necessarily have had in mind, but nevertheless, I thought the use of the term by you of malleability was quite was very well spot on, I think. So the next thing on the list is, we don't really have to spend too much time on this. Some thoughts on electoral politics, which is on page 135. It only extends for like 3 pages, doesn't it? So this is pretty simple. We can actually just deal with this quite quickly. But I wanted to, it wasn't just a throwaway assignment or choice. Some thoughts on electoral politics. This is something he wrote just after some election which took place in Italy in 1953. It says June 7th, 1953 in the footnote. But it's very clear here that Evola absolutely despises electoral politics and party politics, and he really registers his complete and total disgust for party politics and how the honorable aristocratic person would not engage in all of these sorts of tactics and antics which are involved in politicking, in canvassing votes and engaging and being involved in an election. And he sees it as kind of contradictory. So apparently the individuals there were some individuals involved in this election who were actually against the notion of democracy and democratic ideals. And he saw that stance as being hypocritical, that, well, if you understand that system is broken, then why are you involved in it? At least that's what he seems to be saying. In as much as if you see the flaws of democracy, then how can you involve yourself in its processes and its rituals and its exercise? Of course, and I suppose that the response as well, to gain power and then to make a change, but he's really showing registering his disgust that this is not possible, that the whole thing is sort of rotten from within and it can't be changed. And this is obviously well after the end of the Second World War, and so whatever possibilities he saw for a kind of ascending nationalism in the fascist teachings of Mussolini, who at least was a monarchist and had some other maybe positive aspects in the view of Julius Evola, he obviously sees all of this as being a complete lost cause by now. So that's really all I have to say about that essay, and that's why I put it in there, because I think again a lot of people who are on the right wing who might today who might identify themselves as followers of Evola, they need to read something like this and see, look, he's completely against the kind of antics that people like Steve Bannon, who supposedly reads Evola or read Evola, how, and you're involved with the Republican Party and you're involved with all this, it doesn't make sense. And really, if Evola upholds, as is very clear, an idea of a kind of hierarchical division of society into the castes, which keep coming up, this quadripartition with the ascetic at the highest, and the warrior and the merchant and the serf. He sees this as being quite significant. Even the idea of the heroic sort of royal figures there, and the idea of the family, it's a theme that runs throughout. And what he really is interested in is this kind of sacred regality, namely what I would prefer to call the philosopher king. And it is in the context of the review of a book by a British writer in favor of monarchy that Evola, in the next essay from pages 161 to 174 of the same book, The Metaphysics of Power, turns to a discussion of monarchy. This is a long essay, but I think we can still go over it in the next few minutes. And I'm getting a little tired now, so I think maybe we'll just conclude after discussing on monarchy. So the book in question that was the occasion for him penning this extended review article was the book by someone named C. Petrie. The footnote on page 161 is actually Sir Charles Petrie. So he wrote a book called Monarchy, and in the footnote it says it's a controversial and outspoken book on the future of monarchy in Europe. This appeared in London, published by Ayer and Spottiswoode in the year 1933. So I'm not sure what year this article was written, but the book in question came out in 1933. The author, Sir Charles Petrie, was apparently known to the Italian public, according to Evola, in his for his recognition of the significance of European fascism, and that apparently he had made a presentation in Italy at the Royal Academy of Sciences, as well, perhaps in favor of, in some way or another, in favor of European fascism. Evola thinks that this is an interesting book. He says it makes for clear and interesting reading, in his words. So in many ways, he agrees with what Sir Charles Petrie has to say, but in other respects, he differs with him. And I would say that he sees Petrie as being right about many things, but in most instances, he is right for the wrong reasons, or just happens to get it right without much reasoning. So Evola is against the idea that monarchy is nothing more than a vestige of the past or a kind of anachronism, which is, therefore outdated, and should be rejected and looked down upon in this age of truly civilized and evolved, Western society of the 20th century, and that we should be ashamed of monarchy now, and we've evolved beyond that in the direction of more congenial forms of political organization, namely liberal democracy. So for him, hereditary monarchy is far from being a lost cause, and he thinks that the principle of monarchy is still valid, regardless of whether certain royal figures or monarchs or representatives of different dynasties in his time, whether they lived up to the monarchic principle or not is another matter, but the principle of monarchy he still upholds. So he very much is opposed to this kind of mentality that sees people who are royalist or monarchist as being some kind of throwbacks, some sort of troglodytic Neanderthals, or mere idiots of the kind, who say that the world is flat and things like this. He sees a potential a return to monarchy, if that were possible, to be a return to normality. And he says here at the bottom, page 162, hence to return to normality. Again, he's talking in the context of Petrie's book. To return to normality, what is required in the first place is a radical renewal of mentality, a renewal which takes as its first condition the liquidation of such attitudes. The illusion of progress is in reality based on the limited vision of those who assume as their supreme criterion what can be referred to the purely material and thus inferior aspects of civilization. He lauds the fact that Sir Charles Petrie speaks when analyzing the matter historically. He lauds the fact that Charles Petrie speaks of the eclipse of hereditary monarchy as coinciding with an era of regression and chaos. Now, you have to keep in mind that Sir Charles Petrie is not a traditionalist author. He's not aware of these doctrines of the Kali Yuga. He just is lamenting, as a kind of simple, I would say, conservative individual, the decline in monarchy in Europe and the waning of its influence. On page 164, Evola says, as we will shortly see, the principal foundation of the monarchical principle and of its superior right is to be found in its possibility of spiritualizing and dignifying political life and of granting a higher justification to the principle of authority. On the other hand, in the terms of mere economico-animal well-being, which is to say on the basis of the trivial equation well-being equals happiness, the utopian prospects proper to the technological Marxist or Sovietic messianism could well be called a political regime or ideal in which, through the rational destruction of every higher human interest, even the premises for the right of a monarchy would not be posed in the least, nor could they hold good. So although Petrie doesn't really write from that point of view, he's not really approaching these things on the level of spirituality, on the spiritual plane. At best, Petrie stands merely upon an ethical plane, or writes from an ethical perspective. One, when he observes that to liken the monarchs to something like hereditary presidents, he says, is to demonstrate a fundamental ignorance of the highest attributes of regality. So, an elected executive someone who holds an executive office to which he or she is elected, as in the case of a president, which you would have in the United States, or something like a prime minister. Such a person assumes the office more or less as a high-ranking functionary fills his post. Although different is the attitude of altogether different is the attitude of a monarch who fully assumes his responsibility and his dignity. So a president merely swears obedience to the principles of some, say, constitution, a constitution created by men, and a king crowned by the church of his country as God's representative on earth are things as different from one another as a diamond and an artificial stone. Those are quotes from Charles Petrie. Petrie sees monarchy as something that not even money can purchase. So all of this is accepted by Evola as well. He agrees with this. But Evola is not really satisfied with his justification for monarchy. Again, Petrie is writing, according to Evola, I haven't read Petrie's book, from merely an ethical, and then I would say maybe some sort of a perspective of conservatism, rather than writing from a point of view of metaphysical or spiritual principles. Evola is particularly upset by the following phrase or sentence from Petrie's book, which he says occurs on page 263. These are Petrie's words. Today in the 20th century, it is not necessary. That's italics. Whether emphasis was added here or not, I don't know. Today in the 20th century, it is not necessary, italics, that the monarchs raise the question of divine right. Evola does not like this. Evola glosses this by exclaiming, so far as we are concerned, precisely the opposite is true. And if anything, it should be said that the theory of divine right is still too little. So Evola goes even beyond people who talk about the divine right of kings. And he says that if we seek the highest traditional justification of regality, we find it in a conception according to which the state, and still more the empire, I'm glad he put that in parentheses, empire, has a meaning of its own transcendent purpose, and appears as a triumph of cosmos over chaos. This is the third time I think this has come up today. The triumph of, as a triumph of cosmos over chaos, as an efficacious formation operated by a force from on high, as the ancients said, by a force of the overworld, within the naturalistic element of the demos, and in general of everything which is merely ethic, biological, and in a restricted sense, human. Very interesting. And I think it's good that, you know, he used the word empire here, because whenever he's using the word state, the contemporary reader may fall into error. Even though it's very clear that he doesn't mean that. Just, you know, words and their usage really go closely together. And now in the minds of most people, when you use the word state, it has a completely different image and completely different, you know, connotation and denotation. So the king or the monarch is the apex, really, of the hierarchy. It's the point, he says, in which this force from on high eminently manifests itself and gathers itself, and rendered itself efficacious, conferring on the state, the empire, the aforementioned transcendent significance. Now, for Evola, the monarch embodies and personifies the primordial unity of sword and scepter, of the regal function with the pontifical function. We saw this again earlier in I think in his essay on the decline of the concept of the state. where he talks about how the word pontifex in its original Latin signification means a maker of bridges. And so the monarch, the philosopher king, I would say, was, or he constituted a kind of interspace, a connection, a bridge between our world and heaven, or between the natural and the supernatural. Lex animata in terris, as the Latin phrase he uses, which is from the Ghibelline expression, if that's the right pronunciation. And he's very fascinated with the Ghibelline dynasty. And so this is the supreme point of reference for every action of transfiguring devotion on the part of the various elements of the social whole, which the sacred monarch headed. And this is what Evola sees as the supreme basis for true hierarchy, the unification, the unity of the regnum and the sacerdotum, the regal function with the pontifical function. And he has elsewhere, he says, through the widest possible documentation, we have elsewhere demonstrated the universality of this primordial conception of regality. And we read that essay and we talked about that before. And we have equally demonstrated that in the highest form in which the two powers are united, that is the temporal and the spiritual, the virile and the sacred, the doctrine of divine right, as in nearer times it has been professed in Europe, refers already to a period in which the original teaching of a certain degree had already undergone a darkening, and in the place of a regality, spiritual or divine in and of itself, and having directly in itself the principle of its transcendent legitimacy, there had come about a regality which was spiritual and legitimate only through the mediation of a priestly caste or church institution, or church, which were in turn distinct from it. So he sees this doctrine of the divine right of kings as already a kind of degeneration, and the traditional justification of regality is through the unity, in fact, of the pontifical and the priestly, of the royal or the regal function with the pontifical or priestly function, and that was conferred from on high, and that such a monarch, a genuine, what I would call philosopher king, had an innate and inherent dignity before which all people bowed, as it were, and submitted in obeisance. And in that regard, Sir Charles Petrie just doesn't go far enough in Evola's view, and I don't really think that Petrie even had the intellectual qualification, the education to have made his case in that way. So that's his understanding of the doctrine of divine right. So whenever this spiritual element is missing, whenever that movement towards the secularization of monarchy, of which the first step is degeneration into its justification by merely invoking divine right conferred by a priestly caste, that is the beginning of the unraveling of the concept. And so when monarchy as an ideal loses this force, this is page 168, monarchy can be nothing more than a mere surviving remnant, avoided symbol, and the monarchical system descends in its dignity to the same plane as any other political regime against which it no longer possesses any higher right. And there's an italicized phrase here on the first paragraph on 168. A secularized monarchy is a monarchy which has dug its own grave. One other positive aspect he sees in Petrie's book is how Petrie makes the observation that the present era is one of a materialistic forma mentis, uses a Latin phrase. We would probably today just say mindset. And this materialistic mindset is all pervading, and modern man if he is not able to rid himself of this materialistic mindset, he's not going to be able to revolutionize, as he says, in a traditional sense, which is to say, in a spiritual sense, by reawakening forms of sensibility and types of interest that have fallen into atrophy. Then the secularized, bureaucratized modern man, reduced to nothing more than a political animal in the lowest sense of the term, will lack the suitable soil for the monarchical principle to bear fruit. So essentially, Ḥāኢና is saying, and Evola agrees, that the reason that most people reject monarchy today is because of the materialistic mindset that they have. Because if they have a materialistic mindset, they're certainly not even going to accept the even more degenerated justification for monarchy, namely divine right. And they're certainly not going to accept the more, sublimated doctrine of Evola of the primordial unity of sword and scepter of regal and pontifical dignities in one person. So having then discussed all of that, Evola now wants to deal with a question which arises, especially in the mind of modern people who have a materialist mindset, in which they just equate monarchy with dictatorship. And of course, dictatorship is bad in their mind because they think that democracy, liberal democracy, is the best form of government. So he wants to now address the problem of the relationship between monarchy and dictatorship. Right. Here he thinks that Ḥāኢና provides the correct solution, but again, he's right for the wrong reasons. Evola says he provides the correct solution more by instinct than by direct knowledge of the doctrinal premises that we have indicated above. So Ḥāኢና apparently is of the view that the only effective way, with the decline of monarchy now, of repairing the evil brought by democratic administrations through some kind of a dictatorship, is the only effective means. However, Ḥāኢና is of the view that the whole of human history demonstrates that dictatorship is generally a temporary expedient. There were very few tyrannies in ancient Greece that lasted more than a single generation, for example, he observes. So it seems that Evola is not entirely against the notion of dictatorship, if it is a means of addressing some of the problems that arise out of democracy. So what does that mean? Well, that means that there is a kind of complementarity, he says, between dictatorship and true monarchy. So on page 169, he writes, in the traditional concept, there is therefore no antithesis, but rather a complementarity between the two functions. The king represents the divine element. We are tempted to say the Olympian element, which assures the stability of the center and the influence of a higher nature and dynastic continuity. The dictator is a fateful apparition in whom the force of the demos is gathered for decisive action during points of crisis or danger in the laical history of a nation. Now, this is where things turn towards contemporary historical realities at the time he was writing. So he thinks that it's quite natural for Ḥāኢና to indicate in his book anyway, in the Constitution of Fascist Italy, a living and salutary example of the application of these ideas. The fact that Mussolini did not hesitate to recognize in monarchy the, quote, Petrie's words, the sacred, glorious, traditional, millennial symbol of the fatherland. That for him, quote, the nation is summed up in the august name of the king, unquote, whose memory, quote, represents the continuity, the vitality, and the health of our race, unquote. This, in truth, demonstrates how much fascism is interpenetrated with a healthy traditionalism and how much it presents to the world the example of a dictatorship purified of this demagogic, contingent, irrational element, which in other cases ever accompany it. So Evola obviously is another what he thought, what he saw as a kind of positive element in the fascism of Mussolini of his day, and perhaps he held out some sort of hope for a kind of reconstruction, as we read in the first essay we discussed today, of the concept of the state of the empire in fascism through this kind of a veneration for monarchy and the kind of nationalism which Mussolini was espousing. So a few more points on monarchy and how it relates to nationalism. We just mentioned again, evoked nationalism just a moment ago. So there is a kind of downward moving nationalism, which really is the kind that we find in the French Revolution, which we find the destruction of the monarchies. But there is a different kind of quality in monarchy that confers upon the notion of nation or nationality something entirely different than we find in profane nationalism. On page 171, he says, monarchy expresses a force of a different quality, which arrives to give the nation a spiritual and no longer collectivist and materialist meaning. In this way, one might say that monarchy represents the supernatural and immanent element of a nation, for which reason it is quite natural that in any group of monarchically constituted nations, the path remains virtually open to their higher spiritual unity, to an understanding attained between their national summits, which is precisely contrary to every democratic internationalistic promiscuity. So this is also very interesting if you see it in the light of this uniformity versus unity. So he says that, if you had different monarchies with each nation, again, or each nationality preserving its unique character and recognizing the notion of divine right of kings in the higher formulation of that idea, as Evola argues, that they actually get along quite well. Whereas when you impose a kind of uniformity of parliamentary democracy on everyone, where you have the demos and all of these telluric and chthonic forces actually dominating from the lower two castes, this only leads to disharmony and problematic interactions. So he says it is effectively this which we find in the medieval period, symbolized by the Holy Roman Empire. Here there no longer existed nationalisms, but nationalities, not formulae of abstract submission, but rather living loyalties to principle with a capital P. For this reason, Petrie is right to say that before the French Revolution, there did not exist among the nations that harshness of relations that we see today. Democracy is the negation of true internationalism. And there was much more cosmopolitanism in the 18th century and before in the medieval period than in the 20th, despite all the international conferences that are continuously being held. So he sees a kind of, again, degenerative and downward movement away from nationalities, as he just outlined, into nationalisms. So obviously, Evola sees a lot of positive elements in Petrie's analysis of and argument for monarchy. But again, he thinks that he's oftentimes out of his depth, right merely by instinct, or right on many points, but for the wrong reasons. And that despite the positive elements in this work, because it isn't rooted in traditional principles and metaphysical doctrines, despite all of the good elements in this book, it seems to really fall short of what Evola really would have liked, and hence his extended essay, review essay of the work. Evola has other things to say about monarchy and the rest in other writings, short writings also included in this book of the Metaphysics of Power, but he has a very extended treatment of sacred regality, which is found in the Revolt Against the Modern World. And in fact, he launches into it quite early on in the very first few pages of the book. So, I mean, the whole point of this course is to offer an entryway through some of the more accessible and easier writings of Evola, and to ease into a reading of his more difficult works, of which probably the most difficult is Revolt Against the Modern World. His other extended books, like The Doctrine of Awakening, is also probably even is much more accessible. I do think that the Revolt is probably his most difficult book. I mean, there are others that are comparable, but I would stand by that. So hopefully, you found this discussion useful. That's all I really have to say about this essay. And if we can obviously discuss, and you're welcome to chime in now on the rest of on what we just read. But I think we will conclude today with a discussion of this essay and pick up next week where we were leaving off. So the floor is open.
Yeah, no problem at all. And that's definitely a lot of content already,
Yeah.
very very that's very detailed explanation. I think the key takeaway about why even the divine right of kings idea is not sufficient for Evola is because of the separation, like you said, where the right comes not it comes from something else, I guess you could say. I mean, on one hand, I think as a I guess I could say, on one hand, it can be invalidated, as it was in, like, for example, the English Civil War, but
Mhm.
that is not necessarily that is not necessarily how do you put it, a sufficient piece of evidence to say that it is to comment on its fragility, I guess, as you could say. I mean, Evola's reasoning in the essay is good on its own, I guess. You don't have to. Even that's already a kind of degenerated a form that it could be overthrown. Is maybe what Evola's also might agree with. Where,
Yeah.
but in any case, I think what interests me a lot is this kind of secular monarchy and how Evola, diagnoses that. Because you may know. Have you heard of this? It's maybe an online right thing, so it's and it's so it's totally okay. But if it's not mainstream, even though it's starting to increasingly be, this movement called NRX, or neo-reactionary. They basically they were
Didn't know that.
started. Yes. So basically, that's their brand name, I guess you could say. And they were started by this individual, this blogger, who his name is Curtis Yarvin, and now he's getting popular in the mainstream, even though once he was at the kind of the fringe of the fringe. Now he's kind of cozying up to more mainstream people, but he hasn't. I'm not sure if he's compromised on his ideas or not. I'm not sure. But anyway, the main point is, in his blog, which got popular and started off this movement, he advocated a kind of secular monarchy, like was described, on the basis that it is a better organizational system where people know their place, and so on and so on. You know, but the main, I guess, telos of his proposal to revive monarchy was that it's simply a better way to organize people, and he even kind of compared it to being a CEO of a country. So I'm sure Evola would have words with him about that. But that's another interesting way to think about it, where you might even say that to think about it in that way is kind of contrary. A monarch of the kind Evola is envisioning would not instinctually not think of himself as a CEO of a country. You have always returning to the heroic vision is Evola's theme. So it's not only for the utility, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of this NRX movement, but again, these are just anemic imitations of the real thing. But the problem is, where is the real thing now?
Yeah.
So all of these things all of these monarchical lines and dynasties have completely degenerated. And I don't see anyone today embodying the royal dignity of whatever royal houses remain. So how is that, maybe with the possible exception of the Emperor of Japan, I don't know, maybe they actually have a genuine sort of lineage going all the way back, but do those people live up to that? And they just sort of live in their forbidden city, and they do whatever they do, and there's the emperor really never doesn't rule after the Second World War. And even in other times in Japanese history, it's not clear to me that he actually exercised power. Where there was always a kind of to use an Italian term, using a generalissimo figure who would be the shogun, some sort of a military, kshatriya figure. At any rate, so then that raises the question, well, then how do you do this? So there's no divine right. Let's say if we just go with the degenerated notion of divine right. So who confers that? Is that the Archbishop of Canterbury when he anoints with the oil during a coronation? How does that work? I think traditionalists would probably not, with a capital T, wouldn't accept the Anglican Church. Most traditionalists have, a soft spot for Catholicism, like get on. Evola's relationship with Catholic Church is a bit more complicated. To go to another tradition in the Islamic world, it's only the Shīʿah who have a kind of notion of a sacred, an absolutely sacred line. Those Shiite imams didn't rule. Instead, you had, certain caliphs, and then you basically had different monarchs and different dynasties that came up in Islamic history. And all of them would try and argue, because there is no sort of coronation. They would all kind of make the case, or the kind of intellectuals and scholars which would be gathered around a particular dynasty who would write an official biography would try and make the case on almost every time that the monarch or the sovereign in question had the mandate of heaven, so to speak, because he embodied or was born around the time of an astrological conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, which is very old doctrine. And so one of the royal titles of sultans and monarchs throughout the Islamic world has always been the Lord of the Conjunction. And there's a very interesting study on this written by a guy named Azfar Muin, entitled The Millennial Sovereign, in which he looks at people like Tamerlane and I think Shah Abbas of the Safavid dynasty in Iran, or Suleiman, known as Suleiman the Magnificent in English, but Suleiman Qanuni, the Ottoman emperor, Ottoman sultan. So this is the kind of thing they would argue for. But now all of that is gone. It's just not going to work. So it seems to me, and also at the end of that essay on the reconstruction of the state, that Evola also was holding out some sort of hope for a redressing of the whole imbalance at the end of time, which has to happen. If the new cycle, in accordance with the doctrine of the cycles, is supposed to be inaugurated, there must be some sort of a figure who in ancient Zoroastrian tradition is known as the Saoshyant, some sort of, I think it's supposed to be in Indic tradition, he's the Kalki avatar. In Buddhist tradition, he's the Maitreya Buddha. The Muslims would say he's the Mahdī. In other Buddhist traditions, like the Tibetans, he's supposed to be the king of Shambhala, I suppose, is supposed to come, and there's supposed to be this war, like you find in the Nordic tradition, Valhalla, Ragnarok is also. So I think that, the only way that true monarchy can be restored is through a direct intervention, if you like, of the divine force, for want of a better term, in cyclical history, and that necessarily has to come at the end of the cycle. So I am not entirely certain if Evola would completely agree with that formulation. I think that Genon would agree with that, because it's a traditional, Muslim doctrine, and Genon totally went into that, embraced that. So, yeah, I don't, see efforts like this NRX thing you talked about, or other efforts at shoring up monarchy to be efficacious at all at this point in the cyclical development of things.
Yeah, and I think to round off, close up the everything we've said.
Yeah.
It's basically a kind of a sudden a model of change that requires suddenness. And it's
well said.
so and again, I'm very impressed by Evola, even in these short essays of predicting a lot of the things
Yeah.
that politics is discussing now in the online right, for example. Just in general, the trend is whether, some are saying, well, we need to infiltrate political institutions, get into electoral politics, so that when the time comes, we can exercise, the correct amount of power, like you said. Then this, on the other end, it says, no, we have to, that's not realistic. What should be done instead is to, like you said, wait for a certain, or a certain conflict must come first. If you and there argue, and on that side, they will say that if you enter electoral politics, the ones in charge, who have kind of are the masters of the Kali Yuga, I suppose, are better at that game than you. They will corrupt you, something like
they
that.
are. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the other. So basically, these two poles of what the right should do in the modern day is a very still current debate. So that's very interesting that Evola can see through that.
Yeah, I think it will be a direct eruption with an eye into history, and that's why it will be so unexpected. No one, very few people will be expecting it or be ready for it, and even the ones who are waiting with great anticipation, they will also be stunned, because it will be such an overwhelming change and a reversal, really, of the entire degenerative process. Yeah, so I don't know anyone who's absolutely truly ready for it. So I think on that note, maybe we will conclude today. I really enjoyed our discussion. I think it went really well. There was a lot of content today, but nevertheless, we managed to cover it, and the discussion was of a particularly high order this time around. It was last time as well, but I know I really enjoyed today's session. Thank you so much.
Thank you too.
Quite welcome. Have a good week. We'll see you again next week then.
See you next week. Goodbye.
Yep. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Stop.